Olá, sejam bem-vindos novamente. Mais uma edição do Tiaços, vai se aproximando do final do ano, e o Tiaços continuando seu propósito de trazer bons debates, bons diálogos e figuras importantes do mundo junguiano para conversar com a nossa comunidade brasileira. Hoje a gente vai ter a grande alegria de receber Dick Russell. Eu vou apresentar primeiro o Dick. Dick Russell, ele é autor de 15 livros de não ficção sobre uma ampla variedade de assuntos, incluindo vários best-sellers do New York Times. Trabalhou por quase 20 anos na biografia épica A Vida e as Ideias de James Hillman, cujos 2 volumes finais foram publicados em 2023 e o terceiro volume sairá agora no mês de novembro. Seu livro Eye of the Whale foi eleito um dos melhores livros do ano por 3 grandes jornais americanos. Russell também recebeu o Chevron Conservation Award por seu ativismo ambiental. Dick, seja bem-vindo. Antes da gente dar a palavra a você, queria mostrar primeiro o volume, né, da Vida e as Ideias de James Hillman. Esse é o volume 1, com 638 páginas, né? O segundo volume também, lançado esse ano, né? Revendo a Psicologia, e o terceiro volume que sairá agora em novembro. Eu estava conversando com o Dick, como é que a gente faz para ler esses livros em algum lugar devido ao tamanho deles, né? Mas, enfim, é uma obra valiosa e que nada mais justo que a gente traga o Dick para falar conosco. Eu tive a oportunidade de conhecê-lo em 2006, em Pittsburgh, num evento, acho que 2006 ou 2008, um evento em homenagem aos 80 anos do Hillman. Nós tomamos um café muito rápido, mas o Dick me deixou uma imagem bastante prazerosa, gentil, sempre guardei com bastante boas lembranças aquela nossa rápida conversa. Antes da gente continuar, eu queria fazer 3 comentários rápidos para localizar esse Tiaços especial de hoje. A primeira questão que eu queria trazer é que talvez, sem dúvida alguma, acho que em nenhum outro momento aqui no país a psicologia arquetípica do James Hillman tenha se mostrado tão relevante, atuante e ocupando um lugar dentro da nossa comunidade junguiana. Há um curso coordenado pela Carmen Lívia Paris e pela Luciana Gimenez no IJUSP, um curso de 2 anos sobre as ideias de Hillman, né? Acho que é a primeiro curso formalmente dito dentro de uma sociedade junguiana dedicada exclusivamente a Hillman e a psicologia arquetípica. O Gustavo Barcelos também, que todos conhecem, analista junguiano, amigo do Hillman, tradutor de muitas das obras dele, também abriu um programa de estudos, se eu não me engano, de 2 anos também, sobre a obra do Hillman, com vários colegas. E nós, do Lapa e do Tiaços, também temos há quase 10, 15 anos nos dedicado a estudar Hillman, suas obras, seus textos, fora vários outros grupos junguianos independentes que também se dedicam à psicologia arquetípica. Então, é um momento muito fecundo do aprofundamento, sistematização e efetivação da psicologia arquetípica como uma realidade dentro da comunidade junguiana brasileira. Isso nos faz todos muito felizes e justifica o convite ao Dick. Uma segunda questão importante, Dick, é que vários personagens que compõem os seus livros, e lendo, é muito curioso, estiveram aqui conosco no Tiaços. Wolfgang Igres esteve aqui, Ginette Paris, Patrícia Berry, Mary Watkins, Edward Cayce, Robert Romanishin, Stanton Marlan, Michael Cipiora, Richard Tarnas, nomes que aparecem com muita frequência no seu livro, e para nós é uma imensa alegria ler esses nomes na biografia e saber que eles também estiveram aqui conosco no Teatro para falar tanto da obra deles, mas como também da relação deles com o Hillman. E um terceiro e por último comentário é que hoje faz 12 anos, exatamente hoje, 12 anos da morte de Hillman, por uma absoluta sincronicidade. Em 27 de outubro de 2011 foi a data em que Hillman faleceu. Quis o destino, quis o acaso, quis a moira, que 27 de outubro de 2023 nós nos encontremos aqui para celebrar a vida e as ideias de Hillman, apresentadas agora pelo nosso querido Dick Russell. Dick, prazer enorme te receber. Obrigado por você ter aceito o nosso convite. Espero que você goste do nosso público. Fique à vontade, a palavra é sua.
Thank you so much, Marcos. Great to be with you today and to see all of you who are interested in the biography and in who James Hillman was. And, you know, it's always was fascinating to me as I got to know him and as I wrote the biography, how connected he was to people in Brazil, along with Italy and Japan, interestingly, more so in many cases than in his home United States. He was revered as a great thinker and very well known. And so I want to acknowledge the importance of Brazil to him. And I'll be doing some readings today from the biography and from one letter that he wrote that relate to Brazil. But before I get into that, I would like to speak with you about, you may be wondering how I came to write this biography and spend so many years working on it off and on. And because I'm not a psychologist, I did not study psychology in school. I am a journalist, an investigative journalist who's written books on natural history and the genius of African Americans and many other subjects. And so it happened sort of, I don't know, looking back, perhaps serendipitously. When I was young and traveling around the world, I became a reader of Carl Jung, who was very important in my life when I was in my 20s. And then later, in the 1990s, around the time that James Hillman wrote his book, The Soul's Code, my family, my large extended family, and I were reading a lot of his work at our place in Mexico and elsewhere. And so we were even having study groups about him. And all of a sudden, then one day, a young man who had grown up in our family, we were talking about Hillman, and he said, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him his organic vegetables in the market in Connecticut." And I said, "Wow, my old friend Wayne, who's now an organic farmer, actually knows James." So I contacted Wayne and I asked if he might get in touch with him for me, see if I might be able to meet him sometime. And I sent him a copy of my book, Black Genius and the American Experience, which he enjoyed very much, apparently. And so we set up a lunch, and Wayne and his wife met us, and my wife Alice and I, and we just hit it off. We had common interests, and we both traveled widely in Africa when we were young. We both liked boxing, actually, and I'd known Muhammad Ali. So we began a friendship that went on for a number of years. He came to visit with his wife, Margot, several of our homes. As I said, I live with an extended family or a group of friends that I've been living with for many, many years in various parts of the United States and one place in Mexico. And so he was very interested in that because community is vitally important, as you probably know, in his work. So he was working at the time on one of his last books, A Terrible Love of War, which was not an easy book for him to write. It's very accessible in terms of its content, but at the same time, you know, he kind of had to experience. He'd been in the war himself in World War II in the Navy, where he had worked with blind soldiers coming back from the war in the first kind of therapeutic work that he did. And but writing A Terrible Love of War was very. He fell down once. It was not an easy thing for him to do, and so I was there sharing some of that with him at the time. And then what happened was in 2004, at the end of the year, his older sister Sue was visiting the family in Connecticut, and I was up there too. And Sue was telling stories about the growing up years in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and she was just such a great storyteller. And I said, you really should capture some of her memories while she's still with us. And so that gave James the idea to bring together as many of his siblings as could come. There were still 3 living siblings at the time, and they all came, and also his kids, and just spend a weekend, several days, remembering things about the family and having it filmed. And so I knew a young filmmaker who'd grown up in our family, and she came to do it. And it was a wonderful weekend. And as the reporter in the crowd, I guess, I ended up asking a number of questions. And then our wives, Margot and Alice, were sitting and talking and wondering if he was ever going. Alice wondered, was he ever going to write his biography? And he had never really wanted to, and didn't want a psychologist to do it, because psychologists often have their own agendas that they would like to put forward. And I was just this journalist who loved meeting new people and exploring new subjects. And so anyway, he decided, yes, he would ask me if I would do this. And there it began quite a long process that went on for many, many years. A wonderful process. It was the first thing that Alice and I traveled with James and Margot to Ireland, where he had gone to college at Dublin, at Trinity College, and loved Ireland, had gone back a number of times. And so we went there together, and then I went to Zurich with him, to the Jung Institute, and began the project by going through this trove of letters, which became a huge part of all 3 volumes, is the letters that he wrote and exchanged with different people, from J.P. Dunleavy, the novelist, who was his great friend, to psychologists like Adolf Guggenbiel Craig, and poets like Robert Bly and others. And he had, when he was young, written letters constantly to his family, to his parents, about his travels and about his education. And so it was just, for a biographer, you can imagine, a wonderful to have access to this. And I made lots of photocopies. And then I began sitting down with him as I wrote what I originally intended just to write one big book, but it ended up getting too big for one volume. And so we had a number of sit-down conversations, in the last decade of his life, where he would always expand on the themes of what I was writing about. He was particularly interested in writing, in having written about, in my writing about his ancestors, because his ancestors were vitally important to him in his psychology, and also his early years in Atlantic City, and then his travels and the road that led him to Zurich and the Jung Institute in the 1950s, and eventually becoming director of studies, the first director of studies at the Institute, who Jung himself appointed to that position. So he, in 2007, we sat down, and he did not like what I might call personalistic biography. He wanted there to be important themes of life, his life and life in general, that would be amplified through the book. So one thing I wanted to share with you, this was from an interview that we did together in 2007, which was devoted to themes. And I'm just going to read you a few excerpts from what he told me that day. And one of them was about his ancestors. And he said, "Why was I so interested? And I dedicated my first book to my grandfathers. I also have it in my theory. When I'm a practicing clinician, I ask about grandparents, about background. And when I give lectures, I say they're more important than your parents. You're focused on your parents for so long, but what have you thought about if you had a dinner party with your 8 grandparents and you all sat down together? I use that as an image. Would you be able to talk the same language? Could you eat the same food? What would it be like trying to hold all that together? So that became one of the themes that I wrote about in the book. And he also spoke that same day about his growing up years in Atlantic City, when he used to collect the autographs of all these famous people that his parents, his father was a hotelier. His grandfather also, and the grandfather on his mother's side was a famous rabbi named Joseph Krauskopf, a reform rabbi, by the way, similar to how James Hillman would go about reforming psychology. But he said, that Atlantic City, which was the very, in the 1920s, was like Las Vegas today. I mean, it was this beautiful, incredible place with, all these different acts on the boardwalk that people could come and see. And he said it was a great background for psychology, having these encounters with such a variety of psyches. And it was also, interestingly, one of the places where the daily news happened, and yet it's a small town, typical small town with all the class structures and prejudices and different ethnic groups, blacks and Irish and Jews and a lot of Armenians. And so he said in the summer there'd be 1 million people coming there, and in the winter it was just this quiet place where he walked the beaches and experienced again all these different kinds of psyches in his growing up years. We talked also that day about the soul's code as a theme. And I'm sure some of you have probably read the soul's code. I'm not sure if it's translated into Portuguese, but it's an amazing book, and it was a huge bestseller actually in the 1990s, after Oprah had him on. And he said about that when I visited with him that day, I don't know about reincarnation. I don't know if you can gather evidence for it. People have, and there are whole books on it. And I accepted that it could be, but I don't need it. Let's put it that way. I don't need that idea. If I'm reincarnated of something that happened in the past, I'm doing what I have to do anyway. But the idea of the ancestors, that one I can accept better than reincarnation, as if there is a psychic genome. The psyche is not inherited, but you're born with certain traits. That doesn't mean you've inherited them, but I think you have these certain traits, and it's your destiny figure. But it isn't necessarily directly coming down from your ancestors. And one last thing I'll mention from that fascinating day that I spent with him, one of many, he was talking about a trip that he made, an experience he had in Isfahan in Iran in 1972. He said the mosque there, the Blue Mosque, I believe it is one of the great wonders of the world. And the ceiling is really extraordinary with all these blue tiles. But during the night after I saw it, I was awakened. I couldn't stop seeing this blue world. And I told Henry Corbin about it because I had lunch with him there 2 days later. And the interesting thing about these mosques I learned there, this big, beautiful door would open, and you would walk in and you'd go one way and then a different way and change directions as you go, which is very different from our churches. So it's a reorientation of your direction. And that was really interesting to me. So I had this vision of the ceiling of the mosque, which was more than the ceiling of the mosque. It wasn't a reproductive image of what I'd seen, but it was set off by that. And Corbin said, well, the mosque did to you what it's supposed to do, so to speak. It opens up the heavenly vault. Quite powerful. And again, unexpected. Now, out of that first discussion that we had about themes that should be emphasized or could be emphasized in the biography, and let me say too that he never censored me. He was extremely helpful because I would give him the chapters to read, and as I wrote them, and then he would always expand upon the themes in an incredible way. I mean, just opening new doors and new people to see sometimes, and then he asked me one day around this time, after we had this discussion of themes, could I set down what I thought were the 8 essential themes of his work? So I set about to do that. And I'm just going to share them with you. It's not a long reading, but I'm going to go enumerate them. One, an emphasis on soul rather than ego and self that includes embracing its pathologies rather than trying to, quote, cure them. Depression, then, is not to be avoided, but is of value, a message emanating from the soul and important to its development. Soul is a symbol, not a concept, existing at an ambiguous middle ground of personal experience and a window into the unknown depths. Soul must be the root of therapy, and its language should be soul carrying, altogether different from scientific and medical language. Number two, the importance of images in coming to a poetic basis of life, in words, in our dreams and fantasies, in seeing through to a deeper understanding. Images as living realities through the realms of literature, art, myth, and alchemy. Number three, following from that, an emphasis on the aesthetic and the sense of beauty, noticing what is around us. Number four, connecting classical mythology with contemporary psychology. We need to rediscover, through our imagination and fantasies, our polytheistic nature, peopled by many gods and goddesses. Also, the importance of ancestral figures, not necessarily of the immediate family tree. Number five, engaging Jung and reworking his psychology, carrying his work and thought beyond inner circles and clinical institutes into a dialogue with the main intellectual streams of our culture, also rearranging the work of Freud. Number six, the importance of anima mundi, soul in the world. Psychoanalysis needs to go beyond the personal and subjective to address the relationship between individual problems and those of the larger culture, for example, the environment, the built world, and so on. We are unconscious of the psyche of the world around us because we're too embroiled with our childhood, sexuality, parental milieu, feelings, and so on. Number seven, there is a shadow to therapy itself. Its emphasis on the subjective, scientific, redemptive Christianism and institutionalization as a profession. It has lost its roots in cultural criticism. And number eight, connecting the psyche of today back to its animal, tribal, and instinctual cultural roots and to the alchemical nature, away from monotheism and scientific materialism. So in one way or another, those are the themes that I hoped to elucidate through his life and his ideas as I traveled the course of his 85 years with him. And volume one was almost complete when he became ill for the first time in 2009. And toward the end of his life, we agreed that there should be another volume, that the first one would end with his departure from the Jung Institute in Zurich, where he was dismissed, actually, as director of studies over a controversial situation where he had had an affair with one of his patients, and C.A. Meyer, who was also hypocritically well known for his affairs, was leading the charge to get him dumped as director of studies. But interestingly, that removal led to what we now call archetypal psychology. And at the end of volume one, I wrote that a quote from him that he said he was out on a branch and I like it there very much. So it was not easy to continue writing the biography without him there to talk with about it. It was often a struggle. I didn't feel competent in some ways as a psychological thinker to follow the threads, but I worked away at it. And volume two begins with Pat Barry, and who was his colleague and eventually his wife for about 20 years, and the beginnings of archetypal psychology. And I'm just going to quickly run through what's in volume two because I really hope you will read it. Maybe it'll get translated into Portuguese at some point. I think that would be fantastic. And you know, it covers the early years where archetypal psychology through Springhouse in particular, and Springhouse was a series of gatherings that took place, I think, weekly, where all these young people who were coming to Zurich in search of Jung, really, and going to the Institute, were taking up these themes that were elucidated by Hillman, by Rafael Lopez Pedraza, who was an amazing thinker, a wild man, a Cuban, and they would dove back into esoteric texts like the Picatrix from the Middle Ages and the Memory Theater of Don Camillo, and sort of resurrected these Renaissance era remarkable things that had been lost, and people like Ficino, who was not really thought about much anymore, remarkable thinker and astrologer, and from the beginning of the Renaissance, and so through those things and through Spring Publications, which James began to edit during that period in Zurich, they really launched archetypal psychology with its many gods, its emphasis on mythology, imagination, beauty, leading then to the Terry Lectures in 1974 or 73, I guess, at Yale University, where James Hillman really formulated archetypal psychology in a series of lectures, focusing on pathologizing as being natural to the soul, going with the symptoms of one's situation, personifying, which is about the various figures that live within us all, psychologizing or seeing through, and dehumanizing, meaning you're not solving problems, but psyche is really everywhere. And that's what we need to explore in our lives, how we relate to that. As David Miller, the religious scholar and close friend of Hillman's for many years, said, the gods grab us and play out our stories. And at the same time, he was going every year to Eranos, this magical place on the lake in southern Italy, where these underground scholars like Adolf Portman in biology and Henry Corbin and Stolem came every year to give their latest papers. And Hillman was the one who was chosen to do psychology, which I read about in volume 1 and 2. I went to Eranos once again, there were lots of letters that were exchanged between Hillman and Rudolf Ritzema, who was in charge of the place at the time. And so that was another trove to go through. And but I had a strange experience there. I spent the night in Casa Gabriela, where Jung and James Hillman had stayed when they were at Eranos. And not only did I have these really mysterious dreams, but I woke up in the middle of the night and I was struck with this incredible vertigo, which I've never had before had never had in my life. And I found it to get out of bed and move across the room was almost impossible. So it was, I don't know, it was like there were ghosts there. And they told me that a lot of people couldn't stay in that room because it was so powerful, the spirit that remained there after all these years. So I don't know, maybe I was just supposed to experience that myself. It certainly was amazing. And so from there, after spending 25 years in Zurich, really, James Hillman moved, of all places, to Dallas, Texas. And I have several chapters about this in volume 2, because one of his big questions was, can there be a depth psychology of extroversion? And he ended up working, he spent some time first at the University of Dallas, and then with Gail Thomas and Joanne Stroud and others, Randy Severson, who is, I think, watching this call, they started the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. And it was an amazing place. I mean, they brought in all of these different speakers and they explored the soul of the city. And Hillman did a lot of lectures about ceilings and walls, and he raised questions like, well, let's look at the fact that today the buildings are anorexic, and technology is manic, and in other words, he applied and paranoia. He applied psychological terms to what we see around us, and it was quite incredible what he did, and had speakers like Ivan Illich come, and he gave a lecture in Florence during those years too that he titled Anima Mundi, Soul in the World, which was his first venture out into saying, we've got to look at what's going on in the culture. We have to engage ourselves with the environmental crisis, with and move beyond this just internalized. Not that it's not internalized, but this emphasis on our parents and all of those kinds of things. So from there, and I described this. I have several chapters on this too. He went to Connecticut. Moved there with Pat Berry in the early 1980s to a farmhouse, 5 acres, beautiful place in Connecticut, and became involved with the mythopoetic men's movement. A huge moment in his life that was really worth a good look in the book, because he worked closely there with the poet Robert Bly and with Michael Meade to dive into things like using fairy tales and poetry for 100 men sitting in a room to get at their deepest feelings. It was mischaracterized in the media as just a bunch of guys out in the woods, drumming and dancing and being stupid and talking about their wives. And that was not it at all. It was very, very deep and profound, and hugely life-changing for James Hillman. And then I end the book with the poetic basis of mind, where he strikes up relationships with these great poets of the day, from Charles Bohr to Robert Duncan. So I hope you'll enjoy that whole part, and then move on to volume 3, which comes out within a month or two, and that's where I get into his last 4 books: The Soul's Code, The Force of Character, Terrible Love of War, and before that, one about the business world, which were much more. And the book, my biography itself is much more thematic now. It gets into a chapter on ecology, one on art and architecture, chapters on Italy and Japan, and then I do get into his relationship to Brazil, and that's kind of what I'd like to move toward now in our last 15-20 minutes before I open up for questions. And the first letter, I'd like to read you a letter, because I said how important letters were to the biography and to Hillman. In this day of email, some of us don't really take the time to craft letters in the way that we used to. And boy, I tell you, that's something that I appreciated in James Hillman right to the end of his life. His letters are just incredible expressions of depth and beauty. And one of them he wrote in 2006 to Marcos, who organized this, and I'd like to share it with you today, because I don't think it's in the book, and it's all about his love, really, for Brazil and going south, as he called it. So here's what he said. He said, "Dear Marcos Quintais, some time ago, I said I would send you something for your anniversary and the organization of Rubedo. So I had this thought that might be of interest to your associates. It's a reflection about memoria. First, an observation someone gave me about the culture of Brazil. The USA is always looking forward. Europe is always looking backward. And Brazil is a culture of, quote, now, immediacy. Perhaps this is why you're so often asking me for permission to put on your website my latest writing, the newest, and you want it immediately, which I write back and say, first use my older papers, please, not so fast. The New World, whether USA or Brazil, have short colonial stories. The Earth natives of the New World do not have histories, they have mythologies. My work is rooted in history. It comes from the European culture, and it comes especially from the Southern European culture of the Mediterranean. It tries even more to move through literal history to memoria. So for me, going south means memoria. And what is memoria? One of the old writers, my memory fails me just who, said memoria is imagination qualified by time. In other words, whether something is remembered as an event of the past, as history, it is nonetheless simply imagination. That's why after an accident or a crime, it is so hard to get factual witnessing of memory from a bystander. Always imagination is going on, even when it is right in front of our eyes. Latin American writing that is called magical realism is much impressed by this feeling for memory as imagination. Time itself seems to dissolve. That is magic. Yet the events are so often placed in the past, in historical memory. These novels, this style or genre, makes it very clear that memory and imagination are one and the same. I could learn much from this way of going south. My way is into the writings and ruins of, quote, history, but as I showed or tried to show in revisioning psychology, the Greece I turn to and use so much is not actual Greece, but the Greece of the mind. It is, shall we say, imaginal Greece. But, and this but is important, but we do turn to documents, scholarship, archaeology, texts. The tension between you and me is therefore partly a cultural tension regarding the meaning of the South. I resist now. I want always those who read me read Jung first and read what Jung read, and to read what I've read, to go backwards, a European idea of memoria. But this is not the right way, perhaps, to go south for your culture. Perhaps south for your culture is to leave time, history, and backward looking. In other words, to escape from history into geography. South, then, might mean more a matter of plunging into the circular, timeless jungle of myth and custom of local people, whether in the city or in the jungle. Then the now would not mean the new, but rather the eternal, the archetypal. My greetings to you and good wishes to your associates, yours, James Hillman. I'd also like to read something that's not published yet, but coming out in volume 3 related to Brazil. And to a section I had primarily about Gustavo Barcelos, who I'm sure many of you know. I used a quote of his in the introduction, which says, "In his written work, themes come and go, as in music. They are not linearly imagined, and actually, in my opinion, we may read Hillman starting with any of his books, exactly as with Jung's writing. It's a circular route with many entrances, but really it's with the optical metaphor that we have a better understanding of his thought. Hillman's theoretical imagination is, let's say, more visual rather than tactile or auditive. For the most part, his metaphors are optical. To see, to review, to look, to see through, to consider, to contemplate, to admire. This thought always implies taking another look at his themes, of vision and perspective. Reading him opens the eyes, and thus also the mind and the heart. I understand that this emphasis in looking was also part of his therapy." Now, Gustavo was there at a conference that took place in Montreal in the last months of James Hillman's life, and brought together 7 friends sitting on stage to talk together about archetypal psychology. And I'm going to read you a section that follows that I called the Brazilian Link. This is in volume 3. In his Archetypal Psychology, a Brief Account, Hillman wrote that it starts in the South, and then venturing there is a journey for explorers. He was referring geographically to the Mediterranean region, but Gustavo Barcelos sought to take Hillman's work, alchemically speaking, to a souther than South, the cultures below the equator, such as Brazil's. Barcelos wrote, "To find soul, we go down. Personal memories, childhood, ancient mythologisms, complexes, archetypal reality. All this is imagined to be stored deep down inside the South of ourselves. True character is also imagined to be down inside our acts. And we must not forget this South stands as well for the lower part of the body." In 1985, then 25-year-old Barcelos was studying at the New School and the C.G. Jung Foundation in New York when he heard Hillman give a lecture and then discovered revisioning psychology. I was almost leaving the Jungians because I thought they were too spiritual for me, Barcelos would recall. But when I found this man talking about soul in a different way, that was a big moment. In Brazil, where Barcelos returned to practice therapy and teach, Hillman was also almost unknown at the time. Only the myth of analysis had been translated into Portuguese. Barcelos set about to change that. At first, he recalls, I found a big resistance to his thought on the part of Jungians because of the attachment of most of them to a more classical view of Jungian psychology. Slowly, I could start gathering some people honestly interested in the renovation of ideas that came with James's work. Over the ensuing 30 years, Barcelos personally translated more than 20 of Hillman's books and published 2 volumes unique to Brazil. Collections of essays on the puer archetype in 1989 and on City and Soul in 1991. Barcelos later organized a conference at the most important architecture school in Sao Paulo, bringing together psychologists with urban planners. While he returned numerous times to the US to participate in courses and meet with Hillman, their friendship included exchanging dozens of faxes. For more than 20 years, Barcelos has brought together his large group of students for biennial weekend-long conferences at his house in the mountains on various themes, such as soul and food and the sibling archetype. His prodigious efforts have made Hillman a household word in Brazilian psychological circles and beyond. In 2013, more than 250 people turned out to attend a memorial gathering for Hillman in Campinas. Why did Hillman find such an audience in Brazil, the largest Catholic country in Latin America? Barcelos believes it's because the Afro-Brazilian polytheism, along with all its different ramifications, is very much alive inside the monotheism of Christian official culture. Theorixas is largely practiced every day in urban areas. Even in an entire region like Bahia, the new soul finds its origin in what Barcelos has called colonial Baroque, blending elements of Portuguese, Spanish, and Roman with Indian and Black influences. As Barcelos has sought to define this, images constantly moving, the play of light and darkness continually disturbing spatial and temporal orientation, orienting the soul to dance and to celebrate the senses, enlightening the soul, but also seducing, disturbing it. The Baroque is the most dangerous movement of the soul. In Brazil, it reveals a true soul atmosphere, extremes of colors, shades, darknesses, textures, candles, smoke, perfume, emotion, ritual, recitation, theater, music, fantasy, pain, joy, feeling, street celebrations, all an attempt to represent and respond to the impact on the soul of an all-exuberant, colorful, wild, dangerous, and luminous nature. The early mixture of cultures, of skins, of libidos, and of souls that took place in Brazil, and all those eyes, white, black, and white, and native, all well immersed in the torments of, marvels, and secrets of the tropical forest, are the prima materia of this Baroque. It's ultimately a pagan Baroque where, yes, we go to church on Sundays, but beat our drums on Monday night. It is not unusual to see shrines in Brazil where the statuette of Christ shares the stage, the altar, with, say, the siren-shaped figure of Iemanjá, goddess of the sea, a great mother from the salty waters, or St. George with the sword killing the dragon, Macumba. Barcelos tried on numerous occasions to bring Hillman to Brazil and almost succeeded a couple of times. Finally, he said yes, and Margot was really pushing for them to come. But this was 1 year before he died, and he got sick and couldn't. I lament this, Barcelos said, because I think if he'd come here and seen the basic culture, he would have been not only very interested, but amazed. So to that, I asked my dear friend Orland Bishop, who was recently in Brazil, in Bahia, and is going on to South Africa. You may have heard of him. He's an amazing person that Hillman got to know during the men's groups. And I read him what Barcelos had said, and he said this, and it's short. So that piece you just read has layers upon layers upon layers of how the cosmology has been reintegrated into destiny. So they are not just living a cosmology, they're living destiny. That the place itself, the geography, has allowed the incarnation of soul forces that have gone a little bit beyond the convention of mind. So when you say soul, they're actually living from the soul, not from a mind. It's not a mental model of reality as much as a soul forging of futures, because the land integrates the being aspect of their lives far more intelligently. So the carnival is actually a ceremonial hosting of futures, and their ritual is actually touching into the superconscious, because the land facilitates a certain kind of magnetism that makes them more real, makes the act of will more real in relationship to what the soul knows futures to be. They are living into it in a far more conscious way than many other cultural spaces. Orishas are actually a part of their environment, not just part of their beliefs. Now, I was going to read something else from volume 3, but it's too long, I think. And it's about Venezuela and a trip that he made back in his 60s with Margot and others to down the magical rivers there in Venezuela, the Orinoco and others, and quite an experience they had in the jungle. So I won't read it because it's too long. I think I don't like to open up in a minute to questions, but I do want to close with just another personal anecdote, I guess you would say. The last chapters of volume 3 are all about how James Hillman met death, which again, I will not try to condense. It's quite an amazing story, and I think you will find it worth reading. I was a pallbearer at his funeral, which was exactly 12 years ago today in Connecticut. And it may interest you to know that it snowed that day. It was still October. And it was the only snowfall that fell in New England all that winter. So the mysteries continue. I was extremely grateful for the help he gave me before this with my son. I have a son who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 17 years old, and I was struggling for many, many years. Eventually, I wrote a book about this too. It's called My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism. And I write in that book about taking Franklin who is biracial, eventually to West Africa for a healing through Malidoma Some's own healer shaman there. And James Hillman, again, is responsible for this because he worked closely with Malidoma and first told me about him in connection with the men's groups that he took part in and where he got to know him. But before that, and I'll just read you this briefly as a sort of coda to what I've been talking to you about today, and I hope you found it worth listening to. This is a passage from My Mysterious Son. So, by the end of September of 2004, Frank is back in the group home, but the repetitive cycle is taking its toll on me. Oops. Sorry, I hit something here. On a trip to interview Hillman for the biography, I decide to raise the big question with which I've been wrestling. This concerns my son's delusions, which persist despite taking his medications. I explain that one fantasy is that I'm not his father, even though Frank concedes sometimes that I did raise him. He clearly does not want to be who he is. He takes on substitute identities as the reincarnation of Tutankhamun or Bruce Lee. So what do I do in the face of this? Do I accept the delusions? Do I challenge them over time? Or do I simply listen and try to figure out what my son might really be expressing underneath? My tape recorder is running as Hillman responds. You listed the choices already. I am your father is one way to do it. Another way is you enter the delusion with him. The main aim is to maintain a conversation, I would think, to keep connected with him. He's testing you. I don't mean in an oppositional way, but just unconditional acceptance of whatever, because you really can't change anything. The tendency is to treat everything as if it's acute, but you need to accept the fact that a chronic condition is different. You have to realize that it's Chronos, the god of time. You don't look for improvement. It's really walking along with, it's accompanying, without any end in sight, accepting what is and just going along. And talking with him, also about things you want to talk to him about. This is a very important part about what you've been doing or thinking. Maybe he doesn't want to hear it, but that doesn't matter. The point is that you're not there out of guilt and fatherhood and all that you're talking to him as a human being. Your normalcy is helpful because nobody he talks to is normal. They all talk to him about being a sick person. I interject that I'd like to be able to tell my son, when you took that particular medication, you were able to go to school, or maybe we could write a book together someday, but we can't do it if you're delusional. But then Frank immediately starts arguing with me. Hillman continues, well, again, you probably have to reconstellate the relationship, not in terms of where you're trying to help him and not trying to go anywhere with him. Simply, you know where I was today? I went to Connecticut. You let go of his being a sick man. Then he may find he tells you things that he doesn't talk about otherwise. You don't know what's going to come out, but it's almost as if you've abandoned being the responsible father because you can't move him. Okay, so that's over with. Make him feel that you really want to see him and tell him things. You say, this guy drove by and I thought, I wish Frank had seen that car. What do you think of that kind of car? He might go into a delusion about the car, but it doesn't matter. You've approached him differently from the therapeutic. I interject again, and differently from my expectations of Franklin. Exactly. It's something that's not your world and not his world, like in the sense of writing a book together, or his world without his medicines, hospitals, and all that shit. It becomes like sitting in a bar together side by side, talking about the day. Yes, I reply, he says he'd like to write his book, not with me. Exactly. The whole thing with the therapy, he's been more inoculated. He doesn't want that. He drives you crazy. That's the last person I would want to see. I used to ask people, what does going crazy mean to you? Does it mean you're going to lay around with your clothes off, go shoot somebody? The other question is, where do you want to be? On an island with no phone, curled up in a room in the dark? Who do you want to talk to? People don't want to see therapists. They really don't. They want to go find a bar, find a lover. All I mean is, I think the most useful thing is to get around all that clinical area that in a way he draws you into, the delusions. Does it do any good, I wonder, for me to try to figure out where the delusions come from? Hillman shakes his head. Very mysterious, he says. And then I go on to write about how the mystery didn't go away. But once I started incorporating that advice, it completely changed my relationship with my son. And we started to have fun together. You know, we went into a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant Asian restaurant we often went to, and Frank started speaking to the guy in invented Chinese, and the waiter looked rather nonplussed, didn't know quite what to do. And ordinarily, I used to cringe and maybe mutter an apology, and instead, I don't say anything, and Franklin doesn't skip a beat. He continues speaking to the waiter, this time in English, while pointing across the table in my direction. Oh, don't worry, Frank says. He can't understand because it's Mandarin. He only speaks Cantonese. The waiter nods and quickly disappears from sight, and I start to laugh and laugh. And Frank has a big, wide grin across his face, and I just keep laughing. So, you know, he was never my therapist, but I deeply valued the kinds of advice that occasionally he could give me. And he said to me at the very beginning when I started embarking on the book, welcome, traveler. It's going to take years, you know. And it did. And I just hope that in the end, what I've written will inspire people to read his work and find the riches that are in it and how that applies to their own lives. Because certainly he was a figure in my life, 21 years older than I. He was a dear friend, a mentor, a biographical subject, yes, that I had to do my best to honor who he was and not avoid the painful, difficult parts of his life, which are there too. So I hope I accomplished that, and I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all today, and I will open up to try to answer any questions you might have. I thank you so much.
Dick, muito obrigado pela tua apresentação, né? É um excelente convite e resumo, né, de tudo que você tem escrito nos livros. Acho que só nos deixa mais curiosos de poder ler. E também queria te agradecer por você compartilhar conosco esse momento tão íntimo, né, desse encontro. Você, Hillman e teu filho, acho que é um momento bastante singular, bastante peculiar, e aonde aparece um Hillman que a gente não conhece, né? A gente conhece muito o escritor, o pensador, e talvez você tenha nos proporcionado a imagem de um amigo, de um grande amigo. Queria te agradecer também por você compartilhar conosco esse belo momento. Bom, vamos lá, vamos abrir para as perguntas. Quem quiser fazer as perguntas, coloque o nome, eu chamo e as pessoas fazem, tá? Dick, eu queria começar com uma curiosidade. Queria voltar lá na Irlanda, em Dublin, e se tem algo que é muito característico das pessoas que gostam do trabalho do Hillman, é o seu modo de escrever, né? Hillman, fundamentalmente, é um escritor. Eu fico me perguntando aonde foi que a psicologia se tornou maior que a literatura para o Hillman, né? Ele foi revisor do Samuel Beckett, não foi? E acho que escreveu um trabalho sobre Joyce também. Eu fico imaginando aonde a literatura perdeu o Hillman para a psicologia. Se a gente pudesse pensar dessa maneira, você consegue localizar isso? Você consegue entender esse momento?
Yes. Yeah, there actually was a moment. And I should say that, prefacing this, that when James Hillman was at Trinity College in Dublin, he studied philosophy. That was one of his, and he also studied some psychology. But primarily, but he also started a literary magazine there called Envoy, with the poet Patrick Kavanagh and others contributing to it. And it was quite a prominent magazine for a while in Dublin. He wrote for it, and he wanted to be a novelist. His best friend was J.P. Dunleavy, who later wrote a very famous book called The Ginger Man in the 1950s. Sold millions of copies. They remained friends to the end of his life. And Dunleavy was kind of his, I don't want to say alter ego, but he wanted to be Dunleavy. He wanted to, and he spent, after he met his first wife, she became his first wife, Kate, a beautiful Swedish woman. They ended up traveling together in Africa and then living for more than a year, I think a year and a half in Kashmir, where he set about to write his great novel. And he wrote and wrote, and it's a very psychological novel, actually, but he never sold it. And then he had this experience, which I write about in volume 1, going down. He was told he met a guru named Gopi Krishna, and who told him, go to the mountain. That's where the big dream will come to you as to what you must do next in your life. And it's on the mountains that will happen. So he went into the Himalayas there with Kate, and he was anticipating the big dream to come, and he had a dream, and it was not what he expected. It was instead his mother and his grandmother lying in bunk beds. Now this, in American colloquial terms, freaked him out. He was looking for something else, something much bigger and universal, I think, than that image. So it really sent him down the mountain. He ended up going to Zurich then with Kate and enrolling at the Jung. He felt like he was going crazy at that time. He was having a pretty serious Kundalini type breakdown, and so he ends up going to the Jung Institute, enrolling there, also enrolling at the University of Zurich. He and Kate are married by this time, and they end up having 4 children. And one day, he's walking down the path from his house, and it was this kind of, it wasn't like a vision, but it was like this sudden realization came over him that he could still be a writer, but he was destined to write about psychology. And it was a huge moment in his life. So that was indeed, and that was in the 50s, once he found the Jung Institute and got to know Jung and all that occurred, to answer your question.
Dick, sim, responde. Esse trabalho sobre Joyce, o que foi exatamente? Você...
He wrote a piece about Joyce in the Envoy magazine, and he used to go there all the time. He lived right across the street when he was in Dublin, right across from the Martello Tower, where Joyce spent a lot of time. One of these kind of mysterious magic places in Dublin. So he loved Joyce's writing and among others, but Joyce was one of his literary heroes at that point when he was in Dublin.
Tá ótimo. Obrigado, Dick. Vamos lá. Temos várias perguntas. Luciana, por favor.
Dick, super obrigada pela sua apresentação, emocionante, assim, te ouvir, foi mesmo, fiquei muito emocionada. Eu queria voltar para um daqueles temas que você falou que você se baseou para escrever o teu livro, que foi a sombra para a terapia, né? Que foi um dos eixos, né? E que você fala do cristianismo e da institucionalização. Eu fiquei me perguntando, isso já era uma pergunta que eu me fazia antes de te ouvir. Hoje, te ouvindo, eu fiquei me perguntando se você conseguiria imaginar o que é que o Hillman nos diria. O Marcos contou no começo que Carmen e eu estamos sistematizando um curso de psicologia arquetípica dentro de um instituto, né? Você consegue imaginar o que Hillman diria para a gente, da gente estar levando para dentro de um instituto a psicologia arquetípica?
Well, I think he would be all for it, so long as it didn't become dogmatic, so long as it continued to open doors to the imagination and different ways of seeing things and thinking about them. Because he was the reason that a lot of the traditional Jungians didn't care for him was because he didn't hold to an orthodoxy. Interestingly, however, in his later years, finally came publication of Jung's Red Book, and wow, talk about a revelation. James did lectures about the Red Book in Washington, D.C., at the Library of Congress, in Los Angeles, and what he discovered was that he and Jung, we didn't quite say it like this, but we're really on the same page the whole time. He realized that they weren't, he was Jung. Yes, Jung founded what's called analytical psychology. Hillman took up archetypal psychology, but Jung was expressing, all these amazing, he's had these conversations with invisible entities. He was doing these incredible drawings, otherworldly drawings. Now, this was not in a religious sense. Jung was a Christian, and Hillman was not. But this was way beyond religion. This was about archetypes, and so I guess by way of saying, he was always ready to be surprised and change, his own, perhaps not dogmatic, but his own view of situations or people, depending on what came up. So I think you just have to keep it. I don't know. There's a lot going on in the world today that young people, I think, they need to relate to, understand, look at what's going on in the environment, all the things that he was calling for in his later years. So I think, you need to strike a balance somehow. Hope that answers you.
Sim, sim. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Lua. Dani, querida, contigo.
Olá, Dick, muito obrigada pela sua fala também, muito sensível, enigmática, misteriosa, por, né, essas experiências compartilhadas que você trouxe. Eu tenho uma pergunta sobre o Hillman mais ecológico. Eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho sobre a experiência do Hillman com a ecopsicologia, né? Ele teve algum contato lá com o Theodore Roszak, né? Que é o organizador, né?
Yes.
Escritor do Ecopsychology, que o Hillman fez a introdução do livro. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco desse momento aí da vida dele, dessa relação que ele teve com a ecopsicologia. E obrigada aí mais uma
Yeah,
vez.
he was very, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't write about it at a great length in the book, but I have a long chapter in volume 3 about his concern for the environment and his work, his letters back and forth with David Abram, for example, and at the same time working closely with Roszak to get the principles behind, bringing a more psychological view of ecology into focus. Roszak was the pioneer of that. They didn't know each other well. I know they spent some time together. And then there was a conference that took place at Esalen that Hillman and Margot and Governor Jerry Brown of California were part of, that I dwell upon in the book as well. I can't recall specifics right now of what was discussed and said, but I do know this, that James Hillman practiced what he preached, in the sense of, when I first met him, he was fighting a big sewer project that was going into his town in Thompson, Connecticut. And I put him in touch with a friend of mine from the Environmental Protection Agency, who helped, kind of move to stop that, which they successfully did. And he himself was always out. Well, he loved the outdoors. He did lots of gardening. He planted trees at his home in Connecticut. He was a devoted ecologist himself, and so that, he wasn't just a guy who sat alone in his study thinking up all these amazing things. He put it into practice. He used his love for the outdoors and the environment, and he had raised chickens. He had all kinds of animals in his backyard, and so that was a big part of him, and one that I really appreciated. And we talked about it at length, because I was like him. I came to the environment in my 30s, actually. I'd never been a big environmentalist, and then I got involved in a campaign to save the Atlantic striped bass, a fish that my friends and I were recreationally fishing for in the summer, and was endangered and about to disappear from the planet. And that really changed me. So later on, he and I talked about the amazing gray whales that I wrote a book about. Followed their migration. I followed their migration all the way from Mexico into Siberia. And I told him the story of these. I wish he had had a chance to go there, but there's this lagoon in southern Baja California, where the gray whales would come every year, and they still do. And they, in the mid-1970s, began coming up to people, and you could pet them in the wild, and the mother whales would introduce their young to you, and it was truly one of the most incredible experiences. At the same time, a salt works was being proposed to that would have destroyed their habitat, for their birthing habitat there in that lagoon. And I remember when I told James the story, he was so delighted. He said, and then the whales, oh yeah, this is what happened in the end. The project got stopped when the president of Mexico, Zedillo, came to the lagoon and brought his wife. And there on that magical place, his wife ended up kissing a whale. And the Mexican president the following week stopped that project from going forward with Mitsubishi. And as James Hillman said delightedly, the whales saved themselves. Isn't that the way it is? So anyway, I hope I've answered something of your question.
Obrigado, Dani.
Obrigada.
Bárbara, por favor.
Ai, que honra poder estar aqui, ouvir essas histórias. Estou bem emocionada com esse encontro. E eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, que é o último livro da Bell Hooks, que foi lançado aqui no Brasil, Escrever Além da Raça. Ela traz uma dedicatória para James Hillman, companheiro amado. E aí, quando eu vi, fiquei muito curiosa dessa relação, porque são dois autores que eu amo muito, né? Assim, tenho muito carinho, muito apreço. Não sabia da existência dessa relação. E quando eu fui pesquisar, colocar no Google para ver se encontrava alguma coisa sobre essa relação, a única referência que eu encontrei foi na descrição do terceiro volume da sua biografia. E eu gostaria de saber se você pode contar um pouquinho para a gente dessa amizade.
Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head just how they first met. That's okay. But they met and struck up a real friendship. He visited her at her home in Berea, Kentucky. Might have been the same time he was touring the Civil War battlefields for A Terrible Love of War, or maybe a little bit later. But they just hit it off, and then they filmed a wonderful conversation, which I think is online. I think it's on YouTube, that you can Google Bell Hooks, James Hillman, and see it. Just about life, somewhat about the racial divide, but real deep soul stuff. And so yes, she was a very important person in his life, and vice versa. And I interviewed her at some length at her home in her apartment in New York. And so that's all in volume 3, and I hope you'll find it of interest.
Obrigado, Bárbara. Sônia, por favor, Sônia, contigo.
Em primeiro lugar, muito obrigada pela sua palestra. É realmente emocionante. Eu venho me dedicando a estudar Hillman há muito tempo. Li o primeiro volume com muita alegria e fiquei esperando, fiquei até com medo que o segundo não saísse. Foi uma delícia descobrir isso agora, que saiu o segundo e vai logo sair o terceiro. Uma das coisas que eu não sei se me lembro, mas o senhor fala muito das cartas que Hillman escrevia para sua mãe e o relacionamento dele com a mãe, mas não vi uma coisa igual a respeito da relação dele com o pai. Não me lembro se no primeiro volume o senhor falou disso, mas gostaria de ouvi-lo sobre a relação dele com o pai.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually write about it, I think, quite a bit in volume 1, about including dreams that he had about his father. And his father was a real regular guy, as opposed to Madeline Hillman, who was Hillman's mother, who loved the trappings of society. She was perhaps responsible for bringing a lot of the famous people over. That she knew Eleanor Roosevelt. She had a shop that specialized in incredible design and fashions, and she was a very powerful woman. James was also her favorite among the 4 kids, the golden boy, as he said she often referred to him. So he said that was kind of both a blessing and a curse. I mean, she was a very domineering kind of person, and his father was somebody who. Gosh, I'm trying to remember now. He loved the military. I think he tried to serve in World War I and then couldn't, just as James couldn't get into World War II as an active combatant. But he was somebody who he really enjoyed being with just regular folks, and was a very prominent hotelier in Mexico, in Atlantic City, and he was also, I think, responsible for allowing young James, when he was a boy, he spent a lot of time going down there in the underground of the hotel and hanging out with the guys who did the plumbing and were responsible for the electricity and was fascinated by these men and just who they were and what they did with their hands and he'd go there after school and just hang out with them. So for him, that milieu was so rich in so many ways, ranging from getting to meet Admiral Byrd and Richard Halliburton, the adventure writer, and all these things that triggered his imagination. I mean, he was also allowed a lot of freedom. He had maps all over his room of different places in the world that he wanted to go, and eventually did go to many of them. And so mother and the father were very different type personalities, and I think he chose them, as he would say in the Soul's Code, as individuals or a combination that could help his daimon or his destiny find its right path. I think that idea must have germinated in him, from the time he was a young boy.
Muito obrigada. Se puder fazer mais uma pergunta, Marcos.
Oh, claro, Sônia, à vontade.
Eu sei que Hillman foi bastante para o Japão quando ele já estava mais velho, e não sei se isso é tratado no volume 3, porque tenho bastante curiosidade de saber sobre essas experiências.
Yes, I have a long chapter about his relationship with Japan in volume 3, and especially his deep friendship with Kazuhiko Higuchi-san, I guess you would say. Higuchi was a scholar that he came to know very well of archetypal psychology, and they were very, very close. I met Higuchi at his home in Connecticut in the last months of James's life, and he was very involved in a memorial planting for James Hillman after his death in Connecticut. But there was just this tremendous affinity for Japan that on both sides, and also in Margot, who had a very, very powerful feeling for Japan, and they went together to not just to Tokyo but all over to visit the gardens and the beauty of that country. And it was the aesthetic, really, that how they did things and how they built stuff, and their beautiful aesthetic demeanor that I think helped shape his view of the importance of aesthetics in his later years, which he wrote a lot about.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Sônia. Eu queria fazer um comentário que a Margot McLean está aqui também participando do Teatros. Margot, queria agradecer a tua presença, né, como convidada do DIC. Também, se você quiser fazer algum comentário, falar algo, fique completamente à vontade. Seja bem-vinda. Tá? Elô, quer fazer a pergunta? Elô está aí? Bom, depois a Elô volta.
Desculpe, eu voltei.
Oi, Elô,
Desculpe.
por favor.
Eu tinha escrito, mas acho que é melhor contextualizar a pergunta. Depois da gente ler o Gigerich, fica um pouco uma impressão para mim que ele sugere que o Hillman estacionou, fez uma grande modificação, trouxe grandes coisas, mas deu uma estacionada no caminho para o espírito, como se ele tivesse se recusado a caminhar ou não quisesse, obviamente, né? Mas lendo o trabalho da Mônica Kronberg sobre o Corban, ela fala de uma experiência espiritual que levou o Corban a fazer todo o trabalho que ele levou uma vida fazendo. E eu me pergunto, às vezes, se essa estadia dele na Índia, do Hillman na Índia, também não levou ele um pouco para esse lado, e se não teria havido uma certa expectativa e também frustração com essa experiência que o Dick acabou de relatar sobre ele sonhar só com a mãe e com a avó deitadas, em vez de ter uma grande experiência espiritual. Ele tem alguma, o Dick, né, tem alguma visão sobre isso, alguma opinião sobre isso?
Well, I don't know if you'd call it a religious experience, but he was a man who emphasized soul and not spirit. And I think that was, by design, and perhaps had to do with experiences he'd been through in his life. However, even after that experience where he didn't have where the big dream was about his mother and his grandmother, he went on later to write a book with Gopi Krishna, write the commentary to a book on Kundalini, which he had himself experienced when he was when he and Kate got married. And I tell that story in volume 1. I think that to also address your comment about Gigerik, I have a long chapter in volume 3 about the relationship between Gigerik and Hillman and their differences. And interestingly, they diverged very much, starting with the conference at Notre Dame in 1992, where Gigerik gave a paper called Killings and took issue with a lot of ways that Hillman saw things. And yet, this was not the end of their friendship. I mean, actually, James valued the critique of Gigerik very much and respected Gigerik as a brilliant intellectual. Felt that, yes, they each felt the other was limited in terms of being able to grasp where each one felt psychology should go. But that didn't sever their relationship. And it was I interviewed Gigerik, and I quoted him, quite a bit in the book, and described a relationship that was difficult, but very fecund, fruitful for both great thinkers.
Obrigado, Elô.
Obrigada a vocês.
Dick, eu vou pegar uma carona na pergunta da Elô. Em 2008, eu e 2 colegas, o André Dantas e o Joel Brinco, a gente organizou um evento no Brasil sobre a divergência James Hillman e Wolfgang Giges. E eu pedi para os 2 escreverem cartas para a gente ler no início desse evento. O Hillman mandou uma carta de 10 páginas e o Giges uma carta de uma única folha. Mas me parece que foram as únicas vezes onde ambos escreveram claramente sobre as suas diferenças. Então, para nós, foi um momento muito importante. Eu queria voltar um pouco no festival de 77, de Notre Dame, né? Onde o Giges apresenta o Matanças. Qual foi o espírito desse festival? Era um festival em homenagem à psicologia arquetípica. Essa palestra do Giges contaminou o festival, perturbou o andamento, ou ela encontrou um lugar razoável de aceitação? Como é que se deu? Como é que se deram aqueles dias?
That festival had a lot going on, and I think James's astrologer friend Richard Tarnas had suggested the aspects were not very promising for congenial several days there. So it was not easy, and a lot of things happened that I write about. What I did with that chapter, and yes, Giegerik's talk disturbed a lot of people, but it didn't disturb James Hillman so much as it did others, I think. I wrote the chapter in a way where I just presented like a reporter, right? I just cut from one person to another what they had to say about what that experience was like. So I think it's in volume 3, early in volume 3, and I think you'll find it of interest because it's like archetypal psychology itself. I mean, it's all over the place. Everybody's opinions were very, and feelings, were very different. And so it was a seminal event in a way because, it was how would I say? It was a celebration, but it was also a moment where the opposite occurred, I guess is one way to say it. But also a lot of powerful feelings happened. I mean, a lot of couples got together. I heard. I wasn't there, but it was before my time. But it's quite a story, and one that I really wanted to interview a lot of people about and get the divergence of viewpoints in the book.
Aguardemos para ler. Tá ótimo. Marlena, uma pergunta, por favor.
Boa tarde, obrigada, Dick, pela sua fala sensível. Você coloca no volume 1 da biografia do Hillman a passagem dele pelo Instituto Warburg, em Cambridge, em Londres. E, na verdade, eu gostaria de saber se você, nas conversas com Hillman, percebe se ele sofre algum impacto sobre o pensamento e a forma como ele pensa a imagem a partir do contato com o Warburg e a maneira como o Warburg concebia a imagem.
I don't know Warburg. I don't know who that was.
Abbey Warburg, Biblioteca Warburg de Londres, de Cambridge. Na página 55 do volume 1 da biografia dele, ele vai falar dessa passagem, desses estudos do James Hillman na Biblioteca Warburg, Instituto Warburg. Se ele não lembra quem, não tem problema.
I don't recall exactly. I know he spent a lot of time in libraries at Oxford and in London. London was a crucial place where the Warburg Institute was. Oh, that's maybe what you're saying, the Warburg. But anyway, that was a huge factor in his
Não há nada de
formulating
especial.
archetypal psychology, because there were all these drawers of images that were from the Renaissance and before, and he spent days there, studying these images, looking at them, and realizing the tremendous diversity of, gods and goddesses and beings and other creatures that the Warburg Institute had preserved. Abi Warburg she was the one who did it, I think. And so that was at that right after that meeting was when he and Pat Berry and Rafael Lopez Pedraza sat together in a cafe and really for the first time set out to define archetypal psychology after the visit to the Warburg. Yes.
Certo, obrigada.
Obrigado, Marlena. Dick, estamos chegando ao fim. Vou te fazer as duas últimas perguntas, tá bom?
Sure.
Dick, no capítulo o capítulo Traição, né, da saída de Hillman do Instituto, é um capítulo muito pesado, né, muito triste, eu diria. Triste, pesado. Queria te fazer duas perguntas em relação a isso. Como foi escrever sobre isso, e no sentido do Hillman tornar essa história pública, né? E como é que o Hillman, de alguma maneira, conseguiu suportar toda essa violência e pressão que ele sofreu na época? A impressão, lendo o teu livro, é que ele suporta nas amizades, nas cartas. Os amigos conseguem, de alguma maneira, oferecer uma espécie de amparo para ele num momento muito difícil. Queria saber a tua opinião sobre o episódio, sobre incluir esse capítulo na biografia e se essa aposta de que as amizades funcionaram como uma espécie de rede de proteção para ele poder atravessar esse momento tão duro.
Yes, well, it certainly did. And he had friends like Adolf Guggenbuhl-Craig, who stood next to him all through this tough period. Others did too, but I mean, it was a very, very painful time for him, obviously, and especially the fact that he'd known Meyer quite well, and Meyer, well, I would call it a betrayal. I mean, Meyer was hypocritically having all kinds of affairs himself, including an affair with who was in Kate, who was Hillman's wife and was in therapy with him, and that didn't come out, at the time, publicly. In interviewing him about it, he was just very straightforward. He felt like it was something that had happened in his life that could not be overlooked. It was part of a very important part, actually, of what happened to him during this period in Zurich, and led to his being forced, really, to come up with a whole new psychology. So, looked at in that way, it was a time that was necessary, I think, for his own soul growth. He had, regrets about it, of course, in different ways, but it was just something that he was not ashamed or afraid to talk about. And I of course valued that and found that very important for the biography. And I did even interview the young woman, not young anymore, but who he had the affair with, and I changed her name, but found that she was also, was willing to talk about this in an honest way. And her husband at the time was the one who kind of went off the rails, pretty crazy, trying to, sue Hillman and get him thrown out and even jailed if he could. I mean, it was not a pleasant period in those ways.
Apesar do tema ser muito duro, é um belo capítulo do seu livro. Acho que ele ajuda muito a entender o pensamento do Rio, mas esse momento que você falou, né, de crescimento de alma, é bem interessante. Acho valioso o fato dele ter sido escrito. Dick, e queria fazer a última pergunta, que é uma curiosidade pessoal. No livro Entrevistas, que é o livro talvez um pouco mais perto de alguma coisa biográfica, o Hillman conversa com uma jornalista, Laura Pozzo. A minha pergunta que me atormenta há décadas: Laura Pozzo existe? Ou ela...
She does exist, but that wasn't her name. But yes, some people have raised the question, well, gee, it's such a personal interview kind of book. Maybe Hillman just played both roles. Maybe he wrote it himself, but he didn't. He was interviewed, and it was a series of interviews with an Italian woman, and I reveal in the book who that was. So you'll just have to read the book to get the inside scoop on that.
Eu sempre achei que Laura Pozzo fosse uma figura imaginal. Então, não é. Ela é real, de carne e osso. É isso.
It's not a real flesh and blood woman.
Tá ótimo. Dick, queria te agradecer por essas 2 horas muito agradáveis, de um tremendo prazer em te ouvir as histórias do Hillman. Nós aqui do Brasil, como você sabe, não precisa nem dizer, temos um enorme respeito pelas ideias do Hillman, estamos trabalhando com ela há décadas e décadas, vários grupos junguianos, e te receber aqui foi uma imensa honra. Fico muito feliz de você poder ter aceito o nosso convite do Tiaços, e que você volte numa outra oportunidade. Muito obrigado pela tua generosidade conosco.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you today. Thank you.
Aguardamos o 3º volume com bastante ansiedade. Pessoal, obrigado.
Well, won't be long, couple of months, maybe tops. I think it's available for pre-order on
Já,
Amazon.
já está encomendado na Amazon.
Yeah, it's a little more expensive than volume 2, but it's longer also, and my publisher felt they had to do that to justify the printing costs. So anyway, nothing I could do about it. But I hope you'll find it worth the price of admission.
Dick, e o último detalhe, o acervo de fotos dos 2 livros também é excelente. Parabéns. Né? O registro fotográfico é muito interessante para a gente poder acompanhar o livro. Muito, muito bom.
Oh, thank you.
Pessoal, obrigado. Mais um encontro do Tiaços. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Oportunidade bastante ímpar de ouvir o Dick falando de um pensador que está o tempo todo presente nos nossos seminários, nas nossas conversas, no nosso dia a dia. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Voltamos quando, Luciana?
10 de novembro. 10 de novembro com a Sônia Carvalho, que vai falar da metanoia nas situações limite de dependência química.
Nossa querida Sônia. Bom fim de semana. Obrigado a todos. Isa, obrigado pelo carinho, pela tradução. Lu, tamo junto. Nos vemos em breve,
Thank
então.
you,
Dick,
everybody. Thank
até
you.
lá.
Okay, thanks again.